Excellent. It's my great pleasure to introduce Katlyn Carter. And Katlyn is an assistant professor at Notre Dame in the history department, where she specializes in the political and intellectual history of the Age of Revolution in the 18th century Atlantic world, particularly transatlantic topics. One of the great things about this book, and I really, really, really want you to buy it. It's a wonderful book, is it's truly transatlantic. It really does cover both the French and the American revolutions in detail, and it's a wonderful book. And Katlyn is a intellectual and political historian of the Age of Revolutions, and truly adopts a transatlantic approach, and that's really, really wonderful. I think we're here today to discuss her first book, Democracy in Darkness. I don't know whether I've told you to buy it yet or not, but you really should. Published by Yale. Katlyn has been at Notre Dame for several years after completing her PhD at Princeton and having a postdoc at the University of Michigan. So it's with great pleasure that I want to have a discussion with Katlyn, but I really think we should give her a round of applause for her book first. So Katlyn, I almost said democracy dies in darkness. Yeah, we'll get to that. Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions. Why this topic?
Great question. Actually, that comes back to something that you just said, democracy dies in darkness. So probably a lot of you have seen the Washington Post, tagline, democracy dies in darkness. So for me, I saw that and I was thinking about that and I thought, well, in some ways, democracy was born in darkness, in secrecy. So how do we square that? This belief that secrecy is very dangerous to democracy, darkness is dangerous to democracy, but that it was so essential actually at its founding and played such a large role, especially in the United States, in the way that our democracy was set up. So that seemed a puzzle to me, and I wanted to dig into that and try to unravel that puzzle a little bit, because I thought it could tell us something about democracy itself and what we mean by that when we talk about democracy and how it actually functions.
Excellent. I want to get to secrecy in a minute. I won't forget secrecy, but what was the biggest challenge you faced in writing this once you conceived of the project?
Yeah, well, one challenge, as you know, the book is really half about France and half about the United States. And so that in itself was challenging just because I was working across the Atlantic. So not only getting to archives and things like that, but also just working in two historiographies, two fields of literature that often don't speak to one another. So that was really challenging. People who are working on the French Revolution are often asking questions and looking at topics that people working on the American Revolution are not thinking about, and vice versa. So putting those things into conversation with each other and finding common questions and where they might be, talking about the same thing, but using different terminology and kind of different concepts, that was certainly challenging. And the other thing is just working in two languages and working on a concept, transparency, for example. That's not really a term people in the 18th century were using. So then thinking about the language that actually gets at some of these concepts that I was interested in, that was also challenging for me in the project to kind of work in the terms with people in the 18th century, but also be translating that to a modern audience.
I'm interested in the comment you just made about historiographies. We're almost 75 years post R.R. Palmer, right?
Yeah.
We're still not speaking the same language. I mean, well, literally, I realize, but yeah. Historiographically, these historiographies aren't speaking to each other still, or we're talking past each other?
Yeah, I think that they still tend to be pretty separate. And I talk to my students a lot about this. I think that there's a certain tendency to talk about a national founding moment, revolution, in very national terms, because a lot of what we want out of it is to understand our country, our political structures, our political culture. And I think there's this tendency to focus on that. So it's rarer, I think, to actually look at one national revolution or moment in a broader context and kind of ask these broader questions that aren't specific to the country at hand. So I think that's maybe part of why, but What I found is that a lot of the underlying things that are of interest to historians in both cases are similar. They just kind of aren't, they're not, directly talking to each other. So it takes kind of putting them in conversation to find where those commonalities are.
Interesting. Have you had different responses from French and American historians
Oh,
when
that's a
you
great
presented your
question.
research because of these differences?
Um, I wouldn't say necessarily different. I do think that the conversation about democracy itself is much more alive in the American context, I think, and historiography. And in the French context, there's a lot more, and I think it's because they're not living under a constitution that was generated, in this moment that I'm writing about. So it's a little bit different. It's a little more distant or separated. So a lot of the debates in the French context are about the terror, for example,
Right, sure.
and they do have political stakes today, but it's very different from the way in the United States there are these focuses on democracy and what these things mean today, because we're still living with this constitution, right, that was created in the moment I'm writing about in the late 18th century. And that's a big difference, I think, in terms of what people are focused on.
Yeah, I've often thought that if Americans thought like the French, we'd say, well, we're on our fourth republic now, or third republic in the United States. So we have the Constitution of 1789,
Yeah.
or 87, 89. It's remade after the Civil War,
Yeah.
remade again after the Civil Rights Movement. If we said, okay, this is the third republic or fourth republic,
Yeah.
we might be more open to change, as
Yeah.
opposed to this, no, this is the original Constitution, we've still got it.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's true. There is so much of an emphasis on this is still the Constitution, right, an original. But it's true that we still use, and jurists and things are still going back to 1787 and very much relying on that and drawing on those ideas and that document. So it is still very relevant, to contemporary
Yep.
situations in politics.
It's a paradox, isn't it? The United States is a relatively young country with a really old constitution.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So to get to the book itself, you write in your introduction, and I chose this quote because it speaks, I think, to the work you're trying to do here at Karsh. The fusing of the terms representative government and democracy has since become so naturalized that today we often fail to recognize representative democracy as an invention that can be traced to a particular historical moment. I think this is one of the central arguments of the book. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we often tend to forget that representative government and democracy in the 18th century were distinct concepts, actually. And there were some people who saw them as incompatible, in fact. To them, democracy meant participation in government by the citizens. And representative government, to a certain extent, is not that, right? It is the election of the few to govern the many. Now, the few are supposed to be the voice of the many, right? But I think we often kind of forget that this took work to convince people that representative government was a democratic form of government. And people had different views about that. So some saw that a representative government as kind of a necessary evil, like wished we could have direct democracy, but knew the society was too big for that to be possible. So they thought, okay, well, we need representative government, but then we need to do whatever we can to make representative government as close to, direct democracy as we can. And to them, what that meant is we should ensure that representatives reflect public opinion, that they look like the society they're representing as much as we can. So you had that camp, but then you had another camp, that's kind of exemplified by someone like James Madison, who thought, actually, representative government can be an improvement upon democracy, that actually having these representatives, we can elect the wisest people to come together and calmly deliberate and make the best decisions better than the people might make themselves, even if they could all get together and do it. And that's a really different vision, right? That required some insulation for those representatives from the people. It meant that they shouldn't always reflect public opinion. And so you have these two views, and they never really get reconciled. I think we still have these two views today of how we want representatives to work. And we can think of them as more or less democratic, possibly, but they kind of get subsumed just under the mantle of representative democracy. But I try to recover that there are these kind of competing views. And, it wasn't a given that representative government would be considered a democratic form of government. That took a lot of work to think about how that would need to look, and what criteria it would need to meet to be considered that way.
You use the word democracy throughout, and we're in an institute dedicated to studying democracy, so that's appropriate. However, as you know, that in and of itself is a term that's historicized in the age of revolution, and much is made about the distinction in the 18th century is made about the distinction between republics and democracies.
Yes.
And we sometimes hear echoes of this today when people say, we're a republic, not a democracy.
Yes.
We don't necessarily need to engage in that discourse, but I'm wondering about the discourse back in the 18th century, which still echoes today. And were you tempted to talk about republicanism as opposed to democracy?
Yeah, and there are some historians who say, actually, for the framers in the U.S., they were using these terms interchangeably, and they kind of thought about them the same, and we are making too much of this distinction. There's something to be said for that, but what I actually try to look at is that was a process actually to make those things interchangeable. And it's not to endorse the view that gets said today that, we're a republic, not a democracy, so we should, not have majoritarian institutions. But there was a considered distinction, right? I think between what a democracy was, what a republic was, and then there was work that's done to kind of elide those terms, and kind of make them synonymous. So I try to look at how that actually happened, and try to recover a little bit of these distinctions to look at some of the complications of democracy. We talk about the United States as a democracy, but in fact, a lot of the core institutions of our government were designed to be anti-democratic. The Senate, for example.
Sure.
And I think we need to acknowledge that and address it, rather than continue to kind of just glaze over the fact, and just call it a democracy. I think we need to think about the ways in which things we now call democracy at the time were called anti-democratic and were even designed to be anti-democratic. And, we need to acknowledge that if we want to think about reforming or changing them today. I think we have to think about what we want.
Right.
Yeah.
So where does secrecy come in? And I loved that turn of phrase you had at the very beginning about our democracy was born in secrecy. But where does secrecy figure into your argument? How does it's a huge theme of the book. So could you expand upon that, please?
Yeah, so what I found is just that in the 18th century, across the Atlantic world, really, there starts to be a growing suspicion of state secrecy. And it's very much linked to a suspicion of governments not being representative. So as you see calls emerging in the British colonies and in North America among reformers in England, and among reformers in France, even under the monarchy, there's this concern to say, okay, if we want a representative government, that means we want the government to be doing what we want it to do, and that necessitates that we know what they are doing. So these calls for greater transparency in the 18th century get linked to new ideas about representation, that it should be this reflective process, that it should channel public opinion into the government. And to do that, the transparency is needed. So we see kind of across the spectrum, secrecy getting deemed very suspicious and kind of a violation of this relationship between government and the people. So we see that happening. That's something we're familiar with, I think. Today, we kind of have those connotations of secrecy. But then what I found is that there's a moment when these revolutions happen. So when they form the Constitution and the federal government in the United States, or when revolution breaks out in France, where they start to build these representative governments and suddenly pull back. And they start to use a lot of secrecy in those governments. Because what I argue is that they kind of have this other vision for how representation should work, that it actually needs to be a little bit more insulated, that it's not really the best if it's always reflecting or having this pressure of reflecting public opinion. And so secrecy can be useful to doing that. So I kind of trace like a shift that happens over time where there is this kind of suspicion of secrecy, And then you see an adoption of it and actually a use of secrecy in these new governments. And then gradually they generally start to open more to public view as we go into the 19th century. But I argue that this moment, especially in the 1790s, when secrecy is used pretty heavily, is very significant for, in the case of the US, securing a foundational legitimacy to this new government as a representative government. And that has really long-lasting effects for how we think about it as a democracy and how stable it is over time.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by the argument you make, and you develop it quite persuasively, in my view, that secrecy could be good and served a useful purpose in governing, and that they have revolutionaries on both sides of the Atlantic have quite a sophisticated appreciation of trying to strike a balance between transparency and secrecy.
Yeah. I started the book from the same place I think most of us would start, was that more transparency is better, right? Is more democratic. And I came away from the project with a much more nuanced view of that, because I sort of realized there are cases in which secrecy might be used actually effectively to promote, wiser or more just or fair policy outcomes, to promote things like compromise or frank discussion among politicians. And there are people in the 18th century, people like Madison, for example, who are making that case, are making a positive case for the value of secrecy to leading to what we might think of as more democratic outcomes, like better outcomes for more people. Sometimes the most popular thing to do is not the most democratic or better thing to do, and secrecy can help us do the better thing, right? So Madison saw that. On the other hand, Madison's really interesting because he changes his mind about this once he gets into Congress and starts working. And I look at the book there are some dangers, of course, for using secrecy in government. Madison comes to see that as more dangerous and kind of flips and says, well, transparency and this kind of reflective mode of representation, it's not ideal, but it's probably the best we can do. And I use the French case to help illuminate that. When I talk about the Jacobins being in power during the Terror, they're using secrecy to set up a system that's very anti-democratic. And they kind of illustrate, I think, some of the dangers of the extremes that secrecy can be used to lead to very anti-democratic situations.
I'm simplifying a very complicated argument that you make well, but it seems to me the two revolutions where secrecy is concerned are almost on different trajectories in the 1790s. So the French began more open and become more secretive.
Yeah.
And the Americans begin with greater secrecy and become more open. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. The French go into their revolution a very different situation than the Americans. They're still contending with a king that's sitting on the throne who doesn't want them to advance the project that they are doing. And for them, transparency is very useful because it's kind of a safeguard for them. They think if people know what we're doing, they can protect us if the king tries to just shut us down, right? And also secrecy, was so associated with the monarchy, which is so, hated at this moment and what they're going against, that it wouldn't have been possible, I think, for them to work in secrecy. They really needed to work transparently to try to get people, on board with them. That's really different than the US. By the time they're writing the Constitution, there's no king around. They're doing their own thing. They have a different set of pressures and circumstances that they're working with, where secrecy makes more strategic sense for them in that moment.
Interesting. Is it too cynical to say that, I'm thinking about Madison now, one's views on secrecy, regardless of whether one is in France or in the United States, kind of correlate with whether one has power or not?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I address that through the book. Like, a lot of times when they're making these decisions about whether to open doors or not, that's a strategic calculation in the moment. And certainly they're motivated by circumstance, their political goals, and it matters whether they're in power or not, and they might shift their positions. But what's interesting to me is that once they do articulate these positions, then it's out there, and they often strive to hold a consistent view, depending on, regardless of what would be in their strategic interest. So we see cases as we go on where, for example, in the United States, Federalists were pretty committed to secrecy. And we go into the 1790s, and there are many cases where being more open and transparent actually helps them politically, but they still don't want to do it because they really don't want to concede that underlying ideal of how the government should relate to the people. And so they're very reticent to kind of adopt a greater transparency because they do remain committed to that kind of underlying vision of how the government and people should relate to each other. And for them, secrecy is foundational to that.
Interesting, interesting. I want to talk a little bit about your comparative approach and the comparative methodology. And as I said, I'm very impressed with the true balance in this book and what it reveals about both revolutions. But you mentioned the historiographies, but I'm wondering what methodologically, what were the challenges you faced in trying to do this? Because it really is balanced, and I'm impressed by that. But
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I already said, mastering or, attempting to master two historiographies that are massive in and of themselves is challenging. Just gathering material. Of course, if you were looking at one national context, you could go much deeper, right, into the states, for example, or in France, into the provincial archives. And I had to remain, more nationally focused because I was dealing with two places. So that's one. But the other is, a lot of people kind of say, should we even compare the French and American revolutions, right? Like that they're very, very different, that these societies are emerging from very different political cultures and situations. And so I think that was also something that I took on board, and I thought I need to confront this. Thinking about the chronologies of these, they don't align neatly. And I think that was something that was hard, thinking about where is comparison warranted and useful, and where is it, where does it not actually work, or, too much can be made of it, or that they are too distinct, to draw comparison. So I tried to strike a balance with that in the book. One example would just be thinking about military, like war, and the importance of military action on thinking about these things. In the American context, they fight a war before they write their constitution, right? And so the war is done by the time they're writing the federal constitution and setting up the federal government. And in France, they're fighting wars while they are trying to write constitutions. And so that creates a very different, situation. That's a really different chronology. And that definitely plays a role in decisions about secrecy and transparency in the process of governing. If you're in an open military conflict, that's a very different situation than if you're not. So, it was just kind of challenging balancing those different things. How much you can make of the comparison when there are circumstances that are very different.
So would it look different if you'd included different, I'm going to get to the unfair questions now. I'm going to ask you about the book you didn't write, what you didn't write. So with that apology, I'm looking at the image we have here. If you'd written about Haiti and the United States, or Haiti and France, would your argument be different?
Undoubtedly, it would change in some way. And Haiti does come up throughout the book because it is an important place where both the United States and France, France more directly, but both the United States and France are dealing with and interacting with actors in Saint-Domingue and then Haiti. The reason I didn't write about Haiti as a full case study is because it doesn't become a representative government. It's much more complicated there. So I do think it would look different if that was its own kind of case study. And I don't know what I talk about a little bit in the introduction is that I think that it could be very helpful for us if you include the Haitian context to just thinking about what we mean by democracy and these revolutions being democratic, right? Because if we're thinking about it institutionally speaking, Haiti doesn't become a democracy. But if we're thinking about it in terms of rights and equality and these kind of things, we would say the Haitian Revolution, by some measures, is the most democratic of these revolutions that we're talking about. And so I think that alone helps us think about what do we actually mean by democracy when we're talking about it, or by measuring if a revolution is democratic or not.
I was involved in a discussion very recently at Monticello about the content of an exhibition in the new visitor center. And a colleague made a really powerful observation. We were having lunch and he said, we were talking about what should be in the visitor center exhibition. And he made an observation which is incredibly, it's really stuck with me. He said, well, in 1776, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, there were probably 150 to 160 people living at Monticello. One of them could vote, which gives you a perspective on these kind of questions about democracy. But that,
Yeah.
So with references, so let's not think of Haiti now. I want to think about Britain, because Britain is an important player in this book.
Yeah.
Both because it's one of the nations France is at war with during and after its revolution. It, of course, is the nation the United States wins its independence from. And early Americans certainly are engaging in a discourse that's British in origin to a large extent. Is this story different if it's a comparative? So what if you were talking about governance or transparency and secrecy in revolutionary France and arguably counter-revolutionary Britain? Is it a different story?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before answering that, I actually
please.
just want to comment on your comment about Monticello and, one person could vote. Something that I try to bring up in the book is that secrecy was really foundational, right, to, I say, the foundation of American democracy. But it's also, in that way, we could think about how American democracy was very exclusionary. And it's not only in the terms of excluding who was part of the polity, right, who had political rights, but also who could see what was happening, right? So I think that's actually a really important point, and is another kind of aspect of what I'm arguing in the book, which is that it's a particular form of democracy, that secrecy enables, and it is an exclusionary form. In France, for example, early on, it's much more transparent. In some ways, that's much more inclusive, right? Women, for example, are not enfranchised, but they're there in the National Assembly, and they have ways of exerting influence when it's open that are not available in a case where it's closed and they don't have voting rights, right? So anyway, I just thought that's a important point to make. But yeah, in Britain, so you're absolutely right. Britain plays a big part in the book. And it's because the American colonists are very much involved in the conversations that are happening there. But also reformers in France, they're constantly looking across the English Channel. And in fact, in the early revolution, a lot of times when they are looking for other examples to compare themselves to or to draw upon, they're looking at England. They're not really looking at the United States. People in the US like to think that the American Revolution, is so inspiring for them. They are looking at it, but they're much more interested in England. It's what they're more familiar with and what they kind of look at more. So it's a prime kind of example and context that's being referred to by people at the time, both in France and the US. And a lot of these conversations and attitudes about transparency and secrecy are coming out of Great Britain itself. So we can see at the same time as the American Revolution is breaking out, there is a big movement within Britain itself to open Parliament to reporters and allow them inside, have greater transparency in an effort to make the House of Commons in particular more responsive to the public and kind of change this view of what it means for that to be a representative institution. And advocating for greater transparency is really part of that movement. So we see the same kind of questions about representation, what that means, and the role of transparency in facilitating that. The same thing is happening in Britain itself at the same moment. So they don't undergo a change in their political structure, but I argue in the book that they do undergo a similar rethinking of what representation means or how that should work.
So let me be provocative then.
Yeah.
Does that mean the revolution doesn't matter?
No, I think it still matters. It still matters.
Pick either of your revolutions. But...
Yeah. No, I think, no, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. But I mean, you're right to raise the point of, and I think this is important, that these kind of changes in thinking can happen without a political revolution or change in the structures of government. But it can be changes in the practices or procedures of government, which is, we might see that more clearly in Great Britain. Technically, in the United States, when I'm writing about the Constitution and the forming of the federal government, that's not, I call it a revolutionary moment, but that's not technically the revolution we're talking about. Usually when we talk about the American Revolution, that's breaking with the British, right? What I'm interested in the bigger chunk, I do talk about that period, but in the bigger chunk of the book, I am interested in them setting up the federal government And that, you could argue, similar to Britain, is, yes, it's a new government, but I am focused a lot on the procedures that they use and practices of governance, more so than a overthrow of a government. I guess.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I mean, just to be clear for colleagues and friends in the room, your focus of the United States really is on the making of the Constitution, not on the War of Independence or the Declaration.
Yeah,
of
I have a
Independence.
chapter on
Yeah.
the war and
It's kind of scene
declarations.
setting, really.
Yes, yes.
So one of the more intriguing comparisons you make, and it was a real eureka moment for me, and I'm sure you know what I'm about to say, is when you say that with regard to secrecy, the Federalists in the United States and the Jacobins in France are kind of on the same page.
Yeah, they're mortal enemies, but they're
Yeah, so
actually
Katlyn, what's that about?
Yeah.
Two
Yeah.
groups one doesn't often bracket together.
Yes, yeah. The Federalists saw the Jacobins as kind of the total opposite of their program, right? They identify actually the opposition in the U.S. with the Jacobins and see them as very threatening. And of course, the Jacobins, and this is true, within the French historiography as well, they have a reputation for being radical Democrats, right? Like the most extreme, the most radical. And what I found in looking at that is that the reason for that, I think, is often because of the types of policies that they were advocating and promoted and kind of the vision they had for society. Absolutely radical in many, many ways, and very distinct from the Federalists, who are very conservative in many ways. But if we look at the way they're actually governing, they have a moment where they're quite aligned, actually, in terms of their view of political representation and how it should work. That they both kind of have this sense that the people don't really know what's best for them, either generally or just right now until we can teach them, right? And so that necessitates us taking this more insulated style of government, or even directive style, where it requires some secrecy, that we work behind closed doors, because maybe what we're going to do is not the most popular thing, but it's the best thing. And we can teach people why it's the best thing, right? And they both have that kind of philosophy, and they actually align in their use of secrecy to enact that kind of vision. And of course, the Jacobins take that to an extreme, very far extreme from what the Federalists are doing. But there's a similar kind of underlying vision there of how representation needs to work. And for the Jacobins, that's a temporary view. Like, their idea is that once the revolution is done, we've regenerated, the people, that, okay, then we could have a more reflective representation. They'll be ready to govern themselves in this way. For Federalists, they don't have that vision. They always kind of view that there are going to be these wiser members of society that should be leading society and making these decisions.
I think that's a really powerful insight in the book, and speaks to the value of the comparative approach you adopt.
Yeah.
But I want to play devil's advocate now.
Sure, yeah.
And say, doesn't the comparison flatten differences and obscure historic context? And so therefore, we get a world where the Jacobins and Federalists agree.
I suppose you could make that argument. I mean, of course.
I don't believe it. I want to make clear. I actually am persuaded by you, but I want you to defend your thesis.
Well, so the circumstances are different. And I actually do think one of the main distinctions there is that for the Jacobins, this is envisioned as temporary. And for the Federalists, that vision is not temporary. That is their vision for how a representative government should function. And for the Jacobins, once they are in power, the Constitution that they write, for example, it's very much about reflective representation, about open government. Then they immediately suspend it and put it aside and say, well, we can't actually implement this right now because we're in a revolution. So they have this vision they want to get to. And they have this idea of a state of emergency or exception that they are in. And that is very different, I think. But I do think it's telling that there is a moment of this overlap. And that, yeah, to say that the Jacobins illustrate the extremes of Federalist thinking about the way the government works, I mean, it is very counterintuitive, but I think it's actually really helpful for thinking about some of the anti-democratic elements of the Federalist vision, which I argue in the book can be positive, but can also be very, very negative.
And even that acting in a time of crisis helps us understand the Alien and Sedition Acts. You know, if
Sure,
we're thinking
yeah.
about the Federalists and the Federalist response,
Yeah.
those acts are meant to be wartime measures for a war that didn't come, but
Yes.
with France.
Yeah.
But I think the comparison there, which when I read it in the introduction, I thought, and then when I got the chapter, I thought, okay, I see what she's doing, and this is really, really powerful. It's really
Thanks,
good,
yeah.
really good. All right, we're at UVA, so I've got to ask you about Jefferson. You write on page 272. In reality, the American democracy of the 19th century was one that had been voided of its more radical participatory elements by 1800 and was based on a people, quote, that had been circumscribed to voters, a group functionally limited by race and gender. And I raise this in the context of the question of Jefferson because you suggest in the book that there's a kind of turning point with Jefferson. On one hand, he's more open to transparency and seems to be more democratic than his Federalist predecessors, but that we see this change afterwards. It's unclear whether Jefferson's the product of that or a cause for it. But before we get to Jefferson, was American democracy really more expansive prior to 1800 than after?
Yeah, I would not say it was more expansive. But what I wanted to suggest is that there is this kind of narrative of the rise of American democracy, right? There's a story of progress. And what I try to recover in the book is that is from a starting point that is in some ways, like I was talking about secrecy or the exclusion of people from the electorate, that is a much more narrow and exclusionary version of democracy than I think we like to acknowledge or think about often, right? And that actually the movement into the 19th century, okay, more doors are open to government, for example, and even Jefferson, he's a greater advocate for more transparency, but it's often it's performative at that point. It's been kind of voided of some of the more radical implications of a kind of dialogue. And it continues to be exclusionary in terms of who is let into that process of democracy. So we can see some elements of American government becoming more democratic in meaningful ways, but it's always for a certain population, and it's often reliant on excluding even more strictly other parts of the population.
Sure.
So I suppose that's kind of what I meant by that.
If Gordon Wood were here,
yeah, well, okay.
He would say, no, but you're missing the point, Katlyn, because clearly expanding the franchise for common white men is the first step, right?
Yes,
And therefore it's, yes, of course it's circumscribed by race and gender, but we've lost sense of how powerful and radical that democratization is. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure he would disagree with my interpretation. Well, I just think that it's not to say that's not a step toward democratization, but that step actually relied on a more intense exclusion of these other groups, I think needs to be more recognized than it is. It's not necessarily that it was viewed as like, oh, this is the first step, and then we'll let in these people, and then we'll let in these people. It was more like, we can let in these people because we will exclude these other people. And I think that's actually really important to understand if we're thinking about democracy in the U.S. and a lot of these, questions about the role of race in that and the role of gender in that. I think it's really important to acknowledge that the expansion of the electorate to more white men was dependent upon the exclusion of Black and other minority groups and women from that electorate.
Right. I want to wrap up so we can give the people in the audience an opportunity to ask you some questions, but I've got two final questions for you. One is, so is Jefferson responsible for this change that you observed near the end of the book, or is he a product of it?
This is a cop-out, but I would say kind of both.
Fair
yeah. Yeah, I mean, Jefferson, I kind of compare, I don't go as fully at this as like the Jacobins and Federalists, but I compare him a little bit to Napoleon, which is probably controversial to do. But in that both of them are really wanting to kind of identify with the common man, right? And have this projection of this connection with the population and greater publicity, but it's very performative. Obviously, with Napoleon, that's to a much greater extreme. And Napoleon also portrays himself as this heroic figure who is also, kind of godlike. Jefferson's not doing that. He really is like dressing like the common guy, right? So they're different in that way. But I talk about how by the time both of these men are in power, there's this different kind of understanding of publicity, as I call it in the book, transparency, which is something that is more performative, and that the citizens are meant to be spectators of it. It's a passive thing. So I kind of use Jefferson to look at that. He's an advocate of transparency, but in this different sense. It's not like he wants to let everyone into the White House in his cabinet meetings. He's very much not in favor of that. But he is, kind of aware of the need to be in public more and to kind of like talk about transparency as an important thing.
Great, thank you. So my final question is, at the end of the book, you do what we're told not to do. You lean into the presentist consequences of this. You mention democracy dying in darkness. You mention Edward Snowden. You kind of take the reader there. You go there.
Yeah.
And given that Karsh's remit, I was really interested in that. Can you briefly comment on that before we throw things open? Because I was pleased to see you do that.
Thanks.
Not everybody would be.
Yeah, it's true. Well, and I wrote about Trump in the epilogue, which, it's like, okay, now he's in the book. But I felt that was kind of unavoidable. And the place that I landed is, yes, there's this huge kind of concern with secrecy in government. A lot of that is valid, and there are big concerns about that. But I try to raise the question, and I think the book does this. And by the epilogue, I try to bring it directly into a modern context of what are some of the unintended consequences or potential perils of transparency, so much transparency in our political process. And I think I talk in the epilogue about how there was a lot of people in the 18th century who thought, well, transparency is the solution to demagogues. The more transparency, the less powerful they can be because their lies are exposed and, the truth will win out. And I think that today, you read that and you think, well, that's just not true. And maybe the more transparency, the more politics becomes like a spectator entertainment situation. And it actually, counterintuitively makes citizens a little more passive because they feel like, okay, well, yeah, I can see this, I'm seeing it, and they feel okay about it, and then become less participatory or kind of active. So I just try to use the epilogue to kind of point out some of those potential perils of too much transparency maybe in government. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. But I want to throw things open to colleagues in the room. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sir, hold on. We have a mic if you want to.
Thank you. Where do the Articles of Confederation fit in between the break with Great Britain and their system and our Constitution?
Yeah, so early in the book, I talk about the war period and the Confederation period. And something that's also really interesting is that the Continental Congress works with great secrecy. And part of that is the military situation that they are in. And we can look and contrast a lot of the state constitutions that get written during the war are very emphasize transparency a lot, actually, and open doors to legislatures. So we see that shift happening there. We don't see that in the Continental Congress. They're very dedicated to secrecy. And I talk in the book a bit about how I think that really plays into how people thought about the Congress and the Articles of Confederation as not a representative government, as more of this coalition of almost kind of ambassadors. And as the war goes on, there are more and more calls for the Congress to open its doors and have greater transparency. And I kind of argue in the book that that might indicate to us that there's a changing idea as the war goes on, Congress is there for longer. We can see even delegates in the Continental Congress start to really wish that they had more sense of public opinion and kind of more anxiety about keeping things secret because they feel like they maybe need more legitimacy, by letting people know what's going on and having a greater sense of that reflective idea. So so there's a big shift kind of over time, I think, in how Congress and the articles work, from how people are thinking about it like this coalition out of necessity to something that seems like it's going to be a more permanent institution, and that it needs to be more representative in that more reflective sense, and engage with public opinion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katlyn, this is wonderful. Your work is really changing how I think about democracy and our government.
Thanks.
You've alluded to the possibility of there being more secrecy and less, and more transparency and less. And we have this kind of analogic chiaroscuro of light versus darkness.
Yeah.
But just like light in a congressional or assembly hall, we're not actually dealing with a binary, and we're not actually even dealing with a spectrum, because you can also, for instance, you could leak selective information that's intended to mislead, or once you let journalists into the assembly, you're giving power to specific media entities that have the potential to kind of subvert the will of the people through mediatization.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate for us on the connection between secrecy and transparency, and kind of blow apart the binary, and the relationship to the problem of truth in democracy and fake news and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. That's a great question. Yeah, as you note, it's not like two sides of a coin, and it's not even necessarily a scale, because if you let reporters into the room, of course, a lot of activity then just moves off the floor into other places. So it creates new realms of secrecy. And I kind of read in the book about how often what is getting debated is sometimes more the perception of secrecy or transparency than the reality of it. And it actually gestured as something that I think I'm heading to in my next project, which is the question of, and I thought about a lot in writing this book, which is, okay, well, what does it mean to actually make a political process transparent? Especially in the 18th century, before there's anything like recording technology, right? That's a very human process. And still, there are limits to how many people can actually be in a room who can hear things, let alone then transmit those things to a broader public of people who can't be in the room. So reporters, for example, become really important and powerful mediating figures in this process of making government transparent. And often what people who are distant, who can't be in the room, are reading, there's a perception that it's verbatim or that they're getting a full picture, but of course they're not, because they're not actually there, right? They are removed. That continues to be true even with modern recording technology. So I think you're absolutely right to point that out, and I think that's where a lot of complications come in, where it's sort of like, okay, it's one thing to say it'd be great for everything to be transparent. In practice, that can never really be achieved. There's always going to be a process of mediation, and a lot can happen in that process that poses, that undermines, I guess, the goals of making it transparent. So it's very complicated. Yeah.
Bill.
I just want to have an observation first, and then I have a question that's pretty concrete. The observation is you seem to be focusing at the national level of governments. And I just want to say that at even the national level, you have both the formal structures that you seem to be emphasizing, but you have the informal structures that are going on that will involve women, as there's been a lot of historiography and others. And then particularly in the United States, which I know a lot more, you also have the local, the state level governments, which are much more actively and directly democratic, particularly in New England and through town meetings and things like that. So this whole issue of democracy is different depending on what your focus of government. So my question, though, is we heard a lot about Madison, a little about Jefferson, had Napoleon. Who were the other principal players in what's going on in your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So first, you're right to note that if you look at this at the state level or local level, it looks very different. And part of what I argue the framers of the federal Constitution are responding to is a perception that in the states it is too democratic, in the sense of there is too much of that reflective style of representation going on. And in a lot of states, there is a lot greater transparency in the process than there will be in the federal government. So that is important to note. But yeah, who are the other players? I mean, a lot of them, so it is these kind of big figures that we tend to think of as these big political figures of the time, in addition to those of Hamilton, Washington. In France, Robespierre, Brissot, these big revolutionary figures. But then a lot of what I'm focusing on is also just kind of lesser known politicians who are also part of these discussions about what are the rules going to be, what are the procedures going to be, and also journalists and reporters, printers, publishers who are putting themselves forward as these mediating figures and taking a stance on this. And I also talk a lot about crowds and people who are showing up to watch these political assemblies happen. And that's harder to access, but actually I found amazing sources, especially in the French case where they preserved a lot of things better than in the US. Partly there was a fire in the US in the War of 1812 and we lost a lot of stuff, but yeah,
Interesting use of the passive voice. The British did it.
Sure, yeah. But
Sorry.
there are really great records. They have like all the records of the people who were the guards for the assembly hall, and they kept like letters from people who were trying to get space and from guards, writing saying we have a problem because every day there are way too many people here for us to manage and let inside. So there are like ways of, I think, getting at that too, what the expectations of those people were when they're kind of showing up. So yeah, those are kind of some of the other figures I look at. Yeah.
Well, you start. I'm studying spies and the
Okay.
transparency. Thank you. My great uncle, Arthur Lee was you probably read about as a
Yeah.
spy. He was
Okay,
the
yeah.
main spy.
Yeah.
Right out during the Revolution. Have you studied spies at all? I'm struggling with what happened other than he's paid for the Congress. He's learning, trying to figure out how to be a good spy and then find out the issues that the Congress really wasn't listening very well
Yeah.
or disagreeing.
Sure.
Will this continue is what I'm thinking? The spies of transparency that is not really working, or is it going to get better?
Yeah, so spies, they do come up a little bit in the book. It's not like a central focus of what I'm looking at because I'm more interested in how political assemblies are functioning, more like, I guess we would almost say secrecy in a domestic political context. But yeah, spies and espionage, that's definitely something I talk about where that's kind of, especially in the American Revolution, that contributes to this greater pressure for the Congress, for example, to operate in secrecy. And that there's this real concern with correspondence and how secure that is and development of systems to actually try to keep that secure. So espionage is an interesting area where, yeah, secrets are obviously vital to that, but it also is creating a kind of environment where secrecy is becoming more broadly used in the government structure just out of concern about espionage and like countering it. I'm happy to talk with you more after because I don't know if that totally answers your question, but yes, they're there and they're playing an important role in thinking about these things. Yeah.
Right. So, hi, thank you. My question is sort of about the relationships between the American and the French political factions. And so you talked about how the Jacobins had a sort of commitment to secrecy, even if it was only sort of temporary until they could create a virtuous society. But the American political factions, like, why do you think, or is there a reason, besides just coming from different political traditions, that the Federalists and the Jacobins were reversed, like, on that particular issue? Like, why did the American Republicans have a commitment to openness while the Jacobins had a commitment to secrecy, and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually comes back to something that Frank was saying earlier, where part of it is circumstance. So when you're in opposition and you're not in control of the government, of course, you have a greater incentive to advocate more transparency. You're trying to get in, right? You're not the one who's trying to actually govern. And so the Jacobins, for example, they even while they're in power, they continue to espouse transparency as very, very important. They don't align their practices with that when they're in power, but they still have this kind of rhetoric of it. And that's because when they were not in power, they were very in favor of transparency, and they would, talk about this as really important. We need to have this reflective representation and more transparency. Then when they get into power, they start to shut doors and start to kind of still talk about, oh, that's really great, but we need to have secrecy right now while we're in power. So one thing is that I think there's just like, when you're the opposition, it's easier to advocate for more transparency because you're not running the government. So I think that's one part of it. And I thought about that a lot over the course of working on the book too, is that these ideas, like more transparency, tends to be linked to kind of a more democratic or more opposition party kind of identity throughout, like not just at the moment, but even like right now, you might think about that. People who are not in power tend to associate more with these demands for like greater transparency. So I think that kind of explains it, is like who's in power and who's not at particular moments. It really influences whether they think transparency is good or bad. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Katlyn. This is really fascinating. I can't wait to dig into the book. Thanks for the conversation and so many thoughts about democracy. I have two questions that are kind of method questions, because one, I kept thinking about the relationship between sort of secrecy and silence, notably around archives themselves, right? So like what's in the archive and what's not. And I'm sure you kind of thought about that, right? But there's this kind of larger question of how that affects, what we actually know as historians.
Yeah.
And then as a corollary to that, in the work that on the Caribbean, notably Julia Scott and others, there's always this kind of question of like the oral versus the written in spaces of democracy, right? So how is democracy practiced through speech versus writing? And notably, in France and in Haiti, I guess in a way more than the United States, just these questions of literacy, right? Like we sort of forget that most people in France don't speak French and we're operating in different vernacular tongues. In Haiti too, there's these kind of efforts to like translate stuff into Creole and have stuff read publicly. And so even just the basics of being able to participate mediated through these really layered language contexts. And so just thoughts about, as in this work or as you continue, are those things that kind of come up for you? So.
Yeah, very much. And in fact, this question of the records is something I thought a lot about as I was doing this project. So even in the context of the United States, like the Constitutional Convention, you think, okay, this is a very official event. There's a lot of records from it. But because it was held behind closed doors, because those records were for so long not available and released, and that was very consciously done, it's very, very hard to go back as a historian and reconstruct what happened in that room. And that was an intentional, decision that the framers made. We could argue whether that's good or bad, but I do think historians need to think a lot more about that when we go back to these records and draw on them for evidence of what happened. And that's an extreme example in the Constitutional Convention, but we could talk about that in any legislative body in this time period, whether it's the Congress after the formation of the federal government or in France, that these records were constructed by people who are, often doing the best they can to record what's going on, sometimes with biases, there's space constraints, all kinds of things that really make those the particular constructions of what's available. And that's even in a space where, there's probably the most records available that we can. So I think it's really helpful for thinking about a lot of those questions as historians. How do we actually know what happened, even in those kind of spaces? And then the language question, I think that's such a great point, that's kind of another point of exclusion, or like a tool to demarcate a political community and determine who is able to see or hear what's going on. It really matters, what language it's available in, if people can read or not, where they have to go in order to find out the kind of information. And there's examples in the French case where, they start to be really careful about what news can get to the colonies, right? Because they really don't want a lot of that news to get there. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Is it time to accept that democracy is more likely a dream that doesn't exist, and start, instead of try to fix it and all that, try to bring a new thing, like start from scratch and have a new system to bring the ideal or the intention of people ruling by the people for the people and stuff like that?
It's an easy one for you, Katlyn.
Yeah. I would say I don't think democracy is a thing that doesn't exist. I do think that we have to just be clear as we can, what we mean by it, and what we want from it. to actually think about a lot of these forms or ways we practice democracy. I guess that's what I would say. I still think it is a very worthwhile ideal to strive toward. But I guess you're right to point out that maybe I would say it's never been, perfectly achieved, and maybe it can't be perfectly achieved, but I do think going toward it is a noble goal, is what we should be doing.
So the world has changed a ton in the last couple hundred years. I mean, you were speaking about language barriers, but even just the time to get communications across large distances, right? And
Yeah.
I'm wondering, now we all, for the most part, have the ability to read breaking news. And has the meaning of secrecy in government changed? Classified documents have been painfully in the news throughout the last years. It seems like some closed doors, even for me in my work, right, are necessary to come to good compromises. But I'm curious if you can speak to what secrecy means now and whether it's necessary for different reasons than it was 200 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think even at the time in the 18th century, you had people who were concerned about the effects of transparency on political deliberation and decision making. And they're operating where it still took time for news to reach people. And as you know, today it's nearly instantaneous, right? We can kind of just like follow everything as it's happening. There's kind of this live updating and sense of feedback. And I think that what that's done is only exacerbate a lot of the concerns that people even in the 18th century had about the effects of that transparency, because there's this sense that it's all immediate, right? And something that I think Madison was, right about or had good thoughts about is some of the benefits of distance and time to just create space to think about things and deliberate and I don't know, calmly and as calmly as possible, maybe consider things. And it seems today that we've lost that, right? Things just move so fast, and there is just this immediate feedback that it feels hard to have a space where you can stop, deliberate something and reflect and think on it. So I do think, I think that's something important that we need to kind of think about, that there is value in that, and that maybe some level of secrecy or some degree of closed doors in particular situations can be useful in creating that space, which there just isn't a lot of that space anymore. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I do think that it can have a particular value in that way. And we tend to think about it as threatening. And there are things that I think, like, yes, over classification maybe of material. Famously, I think when Snowden exposed this program, Obama said, well, I didn't even know about this program. He's the president, right? So certainly there are problems with that. But I also think, like, especially thinking about the way deliberative bodies work and policy gets made, it could be useful to think about, there might be steps in the process or moments at which creating that distance and space for people to discuss and come to proposals, at least, could be actually beneficial for our democracy and helpful.
Some compromises need souls, right? And it takes time, but
Yeah.
Thanks.
So is the hot take a threat to democracy?
Yeah, actually, I would say yes.
I think we need to wrap it up now. So you'll have an opportunity to chat with Katlyn and to buy her book, and she will be happy to sign books, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Over the next few minutes, but can we thank her for her?
Thank you so much. Thank you.